My boss fired me in front of more than 200 employees and called me dead weight. 3 years later, he walked into my office asking for help. But this time, his future was in my hands. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy revenge stories with satisfying endings, subscribe and like the video. This is Revenge Stories with Rinsola. Let's begin. The last person I expected to see that morning was Richard Hale. For a moment, I honestly thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I was standing inside a glass-walled conference room on the 23rd floor of our headquarters in Chicago, reviewing the final notes for a major acquisition meeting. Outside the room, executives were arriving one by one, carrying laptops, legal documents, and enough tension to fill the entire floor. The company we were about to discuss had been struggling for nearly 2 years. Revenue was down, clients were leaving, leadership turnover was accelerating. If the acquisition wasn't approved, there was a very real chance the company wouldn't survive another 12 months. Normally, that kind of situation wouldn't have affected me personally. This time was different, because standing just outside the conference room was the man who had nearly destroyed my life. Richard Hale. 3 years earlier, he had been my boss. 3 years earlier, he had stood in front of more than 200 employees and publicly blamed me for a disaster I didn't create. 3 years earlier, he had called me incompetent, dead weight, a liability. Then he fired me on the spot. I can still remember the feeling of every eye in that room turning toward me. The silence, the embarrassment, the helplessness, and worst of all, the look of satisfaction on Richard's face as security escorted me out of the building. At the time, I thought my career was over. I thought everything I had spent years building had disappeared in a matter of minutes. Yet here I was, vice president of operations for one of the fastest growing logistics companies in the country. And Richard? Richard was no longer the untouchable executive who used to make people tremble when he walked into a room. Today he was a CEO whose company needed saving. I watched him through the glass. His expensive suit was still perfectly tailored. His posture was still confident. To anyone else, he probably looked exactly the same. But I noticed the small things, the slight tension around his eyes, the way he kept checking his phone, the way he repeatedly adjusted his tie. He wasn't as confident as he wanted everyone to believe. Then something happened. His eyes lifted, and for the first time he saw me. I watched the recognition hit him. At first confusion, then surprise, then something much closer to panic. The color drained from his face. He knew exactly who I was, and in that moment I realized something. Richard had walked into this building expecting to negotiate with strangers. He had no idea that one of the executives deciding the future of his company was the same employee he had publicly humiliated 3 years earlier. The conference room door opened. Someone called us inside. Richard looked away first. I didn't. As I picked up my notes and walked toward the boardroom table, one memory came rushing back stronger than all the others. The day everything fell apart, the day Richard Hale destroyed my career, or at least that's what he thought he was doing. Because 3 years earlier, neither of us knew that losing that job would completely change the course of my life. And to understand how we ended up here, you have to go back to the beginning. Back before the humiliation, back before the betrayal, back before Richard Hale made the biggest mistake of his career. 3 years earlier, my life wasn't extraordinary, and honestly, I liked it that way. I was 35 years old and worked as an operations manager for Hale Logistics, a mid-sized transportation company that had grown rapidly under Richard Hale's leadership. I wasn't rich. I wasn't influential. I wasn't the kind of employee whose picture appeared in corporate newsletters. I was simply dependable, the person people called when something went wrong, the person who stayed late to solve problems, the person who cared more about getting results than receiving recognition. For nearly 8 years, that approach had worked well for me. I had built a solid reputation inside the company. Coworkers trusted me. Clients respected me. Even senior managers often came to me when they needed honest answers. At home, life felt stable. My wife, Emily, and I had recently purchased a modest house in the suburbs. Nothing fancy, just enough space for the future we hoped to build together. Looking back now, I realize stability can sometimes create the illusion that everything is secure, that nothing can suddenly change. I learned how wrong that assumption was. The first warning signs appeared months before my firing. Most people didn't notice them. I did. One of our largest clients, a national retail chain, had started expressing concerns about delivery delays. At first, the complaints seemed minor, a missed shipment here, a scheduling issue there, nothing catastrophic. But patterns matter in operations, and I began noticing a pattern. The complaints weren't decreasing, they were increasing. Every week brought new problems. Every month brought more frustration from the client. I gathered the data, compiled reports, created projections. Then I scheduled a meeting with senior leadership, including Richard Hale. I remember sitting in that conference room with spreadsheets spread across the table. I carefully explained the situation. I showed the trends, the risks, the potential consequences. I wasn't trying to create panic. I was trying to prevent disaster. When I finished speaking, Richard barely looked at the reports. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile someone gives when they've already decided you're wrong. "You're overthinking this, Michael," he said. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. No action plan, no follow-up discussion, nothing. I left frustrated but hopeful. Surely the evidence would eventually convince him. It didn't. Over the next several months, I raised concerns repeatedly. Each time Richard dismissed them. Each time the client became more dissatisfied. Each time the risk grew larger. Eventually, some coworkers started noticing the same thing. One afternoon, Sarah from Client Relations stopped by my office. She closed the door behind her. "Tell me I'm not crazy," she said. I looked up from my computer. "What happened?" "The retailer account." I immediately knew which client she meant. "They've started requesting meetings with executives directly," she said. My stomach tightened. That was never a good sign. Clients usually bypassed management only when they felt nobody was listening. "What are they saying?" I asked. Sarah sighed. "They think we're ignoring them." I stared out the window. The city skyline stretched across the horizon. Traffic moved below like tiny streams of light. Somewhere deep down, I already knew where this was heading. The question wasn't whether there would be consequences. The question was how severe they would be. Over the next few weeks, the tension inside the company became impossible to ignore. Emails became more urgent, meetings became more frequent, executives whispered behind closed doors. Yet Richard continued acting as though everything was under control. He projected confidence, strength, authority. But confidence isn't the same thing as competence, and eventually reality catches up with everyone. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, I sat alone in my office reviewing the latest client communication. The message was polite, professional, but beneath the carefully chosen words was a clear warning. The relationship was breaking down. I printed the email, added it to the growing file I had been keeping for months. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. A strange feeling settled in my chest. The kind of feeling you get when you can see a storm approaching but nobody else wants to acknowledge it. I didn't know exactly what was coming, but I knew it wouldn't be good. And unfortunately, I was right, because less than a month later, one phone call would change everything. A phone call that would cost the company millions. A phone call that would trigger the most humiliating day of my life. And a phone call that Richard Hale would desperately try to blame on me. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I had just poured my first cup of coffee when Sarah burst into my office. She didn't knock, she didn't smile, and she didn't bother pretending everything was okay. Her face told me all I needed to know. "The retailer terminated the contract," she said. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. "What?" She closed the door behind her. "They're gone." The words landed like a punch to the chest. Gone. Just one word. Yet it carried millions of dollars in lost revenue, hundreds of jobs suddenly at risk, months of warnings finally becoming reality. I slowly lowered my coffee mug. "Did they say why?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Do they really need to?" "No, they didn't. We both knew why. I had spent months documenting the problems, months raising concerns, months trying to prevent exactly this outcome. Now it was happening, and there was nothing left to stop it. The rest of the morning felt surreal. Managers rushed through hallways, executives disappeared into emergency meetings, employees exchanged worried looks. Nobody knew exactly how bad things were, but everyone knew they were bad. Around noon, an email appeared in every employee's inbox. Mandatory company-wide meeting. Attendance required. Conference hall. 3 o'clock. No exceptions. The moment I read it, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why, But I knew Richard well enough to recognize the signs. He wasn't the type of leader who accepted responsibility when things went wrong. He needed someone to blame, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I suddenly felt like that someone might be me. At 3 o'clock sharp, more than 200 employees filled the conference hall. The atmosphere was tense, conversations were quiet, people looked nervous. I found a seat near the middle. Sarah sat beside me. Richard stepped onto the stage. As always, he looked perfectly composed. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence. If someone didn't know better, they would never have guessed the company had just lost one of its most important clients. He waited for the room to become silent. Then he began speaking. At first, his tone sounded sympathetic, professional, measured. He acknowledged the loss, talked about challenges, mentioned difficult market conditions. Then his voice changed, subtly, but enough for me to notice. "The loss of this account wasn't unavoidable," Richard said. The room became even quieter. "In fact, it resulted from repeated operational failures." My stomach tightened. Something felt very wrong. Richard continued, "As leaders, we must hold people accountable." Then his eyes landed directly on me. For a moment I thought he was simply looking in my direction. Then I realized he wasn't. He was looking at me, specifically me, and suddenly every person in that room turned to follow his gaze. I felt 200 sets of eyes settle on me at once. Richard pointed toward my row. "Michael Carter." My heart dropped. I stood slowly, confused, uneasy, completely blindsided. Richard stared at me from the stage. "Would you like to explain why this client repeatedly complained about operational issues under your supervision?" The room went silent. I could hear my own heart beat. I looked around. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone was waiting. I cleared my throat. "Richard, with all due respect, I raised concerns about this account for months." His expression hardened instantly. "No excuses. I documented every issue." "No excuses. I have emails." "No excuses." Each interruption felt like a slap. The room watched. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked shocked. A few couldn't even meet my eyes. Richard stepped forward. "You were responsible for this account." "That's not true." His voice rose. "Then whose fault is it, Michael?" The answer sat right there. Everyone knew it, including him, but saying it out loud wouldn't matter, because this wasn't a discussion. This was a performance, and Richard had already decided how it would end. He looked around the room, then delivered the line I would never forget. "This company cannot succeed while carrying dead weight." The words hit harder than I expected. Dead weight, after 8 years, after the late nights, the weekends, the sacrifices, that was what I had become. Dead weight. Richard didn't stop there. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." The room froze. Even Sarah looked stunned. I stood there in complete disbelief. Surely this couldn't be happening. Not like this, not in front of everyone, not without a conversation, not without an investigation, not without basic respect. But Richard was already calling security. 2 guards appeared near the back of the room. The humiliation was complete. I packed my belongings into a cardboard box while coworkers watched. Nobody laughed, nobody celebrated, which somehow made it worse, because the silence felt like pity, and pity cuts deeper than ridicule. As I walked toward the elevators, I passed dozens of faces. Some looked guilty, some looked angry, some looked heartbroken, but none of them spoke. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. The doors began closing, and the last thing I saw was Richard standing at the front of the room, looking completely satisfied. At that moment, I believed my career was over. I believed he had won. I believed everything I had spent years building had just been destroyed. What I didn't know was that losing that job wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a much harder chapter, and for a while it nearly broke me. The first week after being fired felt like a blur. I barely slept, barely ate, barely left the house. Every morning I woke up hoping the previous week had been a nightmare. Then reality returned. No job, no paycheck, no plan, just uncertainty. At first, I tried staying optimistic. I updated my resume, contacted recruiters, applied for positions, reached out to professional contacts. I told myself someone would recognize my experience, someone would see my value. Weeks passed, nothing happened. Then came the rejection emails, one after another, some polite, some generic, some never responded at all. Each one chipped away at my confidence. The worst part wasn't losing my job. The worst part was beginning to question myself. What if Richard was right? What if I wasn't as capable as I thought? What if 8 years of hard work meant nothing? One afternoon, a recruiter finally called. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. The conversation started well. He seemed interested, impressed even. Then his tone changed. "I need to ask you something." My stomach tightened. "Okay." We spoke with your former company. Silence. They don't seem enthusiastic about recommending you. I felt physically sick. The call ended minutes later. The opportunity disappeared, and I sat staring at the wall for nearly an hour. For the first time, I wondered if Richard was still damaging my career, even after firing me. The savings Emily and I had built started shrinking. Mortgage payments arrived, utility bills arrived. Life kept moving whether we were ready or not. Eventually, pride became a luxury we couldn't afford. I accepted temporary warehouse work. The pay was less than half my previous salary. The work was exhausting. Every morning I loaded shipments and operated forklifts beside people who had no idea I once managed multi-million-dollar operations. The job wasn't beneath me, but the fall was hard to ignore. One rainy evening, after a 10-hour shift, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah. I answered immediately. Hey. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she sighed. Michael, I should have called sooner. Something in her voice caught my attention. What happened? The truth is finally coming out. I sat upright. What truth? The retailer account. My pulse quickened. Sarah continued. Everyone knows now. Knows what? That you weren't responsible. For several seconds I couldn't speak. I simply listened. The client didn't leave because of operations, she said. They left because leadership ignored repeated warnings. Exactly what I had been saying all along. Sarah's voice softened. Most people knew Richard blamed the wrong person. Then why didn't anyone say anything? The silence that followed answered the question before she did. Fear. People were afraid. Afraid of losing their jobs. Afraid of becoming the next target. Afraid of Richard. I just thought you should know, she said quietly. You weren't crazy. After the call ended, I sat alone in my car. Rain tapped against the windshield. For months I had carried the weight of Richard's accusations. Part of me had started believing them. Now, for the first time, someone had confirmed what I already knew. The failure wasn't mine. It never had been. And something changed inside me that night. Not anger, not revenge. Determination. I couldn't control what Richard had done. I couldn't control what people believed. But I could control what happened next. For the first time since losing my job, I stopped focusing on what I had lost and started focusing on what I could become. I made a promise to myself that evening. I would rebuild my career, one step at a time, one skill at a time, one opportunity at a time. No shortcuts, no excuses, no self-pity. Because if Richard Hale thought firing me had ended my future, he was about to discover how wrong he was. The question was whether I could rebuild fast enough before life buried me completely. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Nothing around me had changed. The bills were still there, the warehouse job was still waiting, my bank account was still shrinking, but something inside me was different. For months I had been focused on proving Richard wrong. That morning I decided to stop thinking about Richard entirely. The truth was simple. Whether he regretted what he had done or not didn't matter. Whether people believed me or not didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was what I did next. So I made a plan. Every day I would improve something, no matter how small. One new skill, one new certification, one new connection, one step forward. At first, progress felt painfully slow. I worked warehouse shifts during the day, studied at night. Most evenings, Emily would fall asleep on the couch while I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and online training courses. Project management, data analytics, process optimization, leadership development, skills I had always wanted to learn but never had time for. Now time was all I had. The months passed. The work was exhausting. There were nights when I wanted to quit, nights when the warehouse paycheck barely covered our expenses, nights when I questioned whether any of it would make a difference. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered standing in that conference hall. I remembered Richard calling me dead weight, and I kept going. Eventually, something unexpected happened. A recruiter contacted me, not for a management position, not for an executive role, for a junior operations analyst position at a regional logistics company. The salary was lower than I wanted, the title was lower than I deserved, but I accepted immediately, because I wasn't looking for comfort anymore. I was looking for opportunity. The company was called Horizon Freight Solutions. Compared to my previous employer, it was relatively small, but from the first week I noticed something different. People listened. Managers encouraged ideas. Problems weren't hidden, they were discussed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was working in an environment where competence mattered more than politics. I kept my head down, worked hard, asked questions, learned everything I could. Within a few months, I started noticing inefficiencies in the company's routing system, small problems that most people ignored, but small problems often create large costs. I spent several weeks analyzing the data. Then I presented my findings. The recommendations weren't complicated, but implementing them saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. That got people's attention. 6 months later, I received my first promotion. A year after that, another, then another. Each promotion brought new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to prove myself. But the most important thing wasn't the title, it was confidence. The confidence Richard had nearly destroyed. Slowly, it returned, not because someone gave it back to me, because I earned it. Meanwhile, I occasionally heard updates about Hale Logistics. Most came through former coworkers. Sarah called every few months, sometimes just to catch up, sometimes with news, and the news was rarely good. Another department head resigned, another major client left. Employee turnover continued rising, internal morale kept falling. One conversation stood out. Sarah called late one evening. You remember Kevin from finance? Of course. He quit. That surprised me. Kevin had been with the company for nearly 15 years. What happened? He got tired of being blamed for everything. I couldn't help noticing the irony. That seemed to be Richard's favorite management strategy. Whenever something went wrong, responsibility flowed downward. Credit always flowed upward. Consequences never reached him, at least not yet. By the end of my second year at Horizon, I was leading multiple operational teams. By the third year, I was overseeing regional operations. Then something happened that completely changed my career. Our vice president announced his retirement. The position opened internally. I applied. Honestly, I didn't expect much. The competition was intense. Candidates had more experience, more connections, more executive exposure, but I had something they didn't: results, years of measurable results. Weeks later, the CEO called me into his office. I still remember sitting across from him, trying not to look nervous, trying not to get my hopes up. Then he smiled. Congratulations, Michael. I stared at him. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. You've earned it. Vice President of Operations. 3 years earlier, I had been escorted out of a building carrying a cardboard box. Now I was joining the executive team of a rapidly growing national company. The journey hadn't been quick, it hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been glamorous, but it was real. Every promotion, every achievement, every opportunity, earned, not given. That evening, Emily and I celebrated quietly at home. Nothing extravagant, just dinner and a bottle of wine. At one point, she looked across the table and smiled. You know what's funny? What? If Richard hadn't fired you, none of this would have happened. I laughed. Because she was right. For the first time, I realized something. The worst day of my life had accidentally become one of the most important turning points in my future. At least that's what I believed. Then, 6 months later, an email landed in my inbox that made me stop breathing for a second. Because sitting on a list of potential acquisition targets was a company name I never expected to see again: Hale Logistics. I read the company name 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Hale Logistics, Richard's company, the same company that had thrown me away, the same company I hadn't entered since the day security escorted me out. Our executive team was evaluating acquisition opportunities. As vice president of operations, I had become part of the review process. That meant I would be analyzing potential targets, financial health, operational performance, leadership effectiveness, growth potential. Normally, I approached these reviews objectively. This one felt different, very different. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Part of me wondered if fate was playing some kind of joke. Out of hundreds of companies in the country, somehow Richards had landed on my desk. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Then I opened the file, and what I found surprised me, not because the company was struggling. That part wasn't shocking. What surprised me was how badly it was struggling. Revenue had declined for 3 consecutive years. Client retention was falling. Employee turnover was among the highest in the industry. Profit margins were shrinking. Operational costs were rising. The warning signs were everywhere. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Several key executives had resigned. Major accounts had been lost. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped significantly. Some of the same issues I had warned about years earlier still existed, only now they were affecting the entire company. I reviewed dozens of reports over the following weeks. Patterns emerged quickly, and every pattern pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't market conditions. This wasn't economic uncertainty. This was leadership failure. The company had developed a culture where problems were ignored until they became crises, exactly the way Richard had always operated. For the first time in years, I found myself thinking about him regularly, not with anger, more with curiosity. Had he changed? Had he learned anything? Or was he still the same man who believed accountability only applied to other people. One afternoon, our CFO stopped by my office. "How's the Hale review coming?" I looked up from the financial reports. "Honestly?" "Yeah." He laughed. "It isn't good, is it?" "No." He nodded. "That's what I'm hearing from everyone." Then he lowered his voice slightly. "The board still wants to meet them." I wasn't surprised. Despite its problems, Hale Logistics still possessed valuable assets, strong infrastructure, established contracts, strategic locations. The company could still be worth acquiring, just not under its current leadership. Over the following month, the acquisition process moved forward. Documents were exchanged, audits were completed, interviews were scheduled. Then came the final phase, executive presentations. Senior leadership from Hale Logistics would meet directly with our acquisition committee, including Richard. The realization hit me instantly. I would be sitting across the table from him for the first time in 3 years. The thought should have excited me. Instead, it made me uncomfortable, not because I feared him, that fear had disappeared long ago, but because I wasn't sure how I would feel when the moment finally arrived. Would he recognize me? Would he pretend nothing happened? Would he apologize? Would he even care? The meeting date arrived faster than expected. The evening before, I reviewed the final reports one last time. The evidence was overwhelming: leadership failures, ignored warnings, poor strategic decisions. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Richard's biggest problem wasn't the market. It wasn't competition. It wasn't timing. Richard's biggest problem was Richard. As I closed the final report, my phone buzzed. A calendar notification. Acquisition Committee meeting, 9 a.m., Conference Room A. I stared at the screen for several seconds. 3 years earlier, Richard Hale had publicly decided my future. Tomorrow morning, for the first time in his career, someone else would be helping decide his, and he had absolutely no idea who was waiting on the other side of that boardroom door. Then Richard recovered, at least externally. He approached the table and extended his hand. "Michael." I stood and shook it. "Richard." His grip tightened slightly, a subtle attempt to reassert control. Old habits die hard. "It's been a long time." "It has." He forced a smile. "You've done well for yourself." The comment sounded friendly, but something underneath it felt uncomfortable, like a man struggling to understand a reality he never expected. Before the conversation could continue, our CEO welcomed everyone and officially began the meeting. Richard took his seat. The presentation started. For the first 30 minutes, everything remained professional. Revenue projections, market analysis, growth strategies, future opportunities. Richard spoke confidently. Anyone unfamiliar with the situation might have been impressed, but I had spent months studying the actual numbers, and the numbers told a very different story. Eventually, the presentation moved into the question and answer phase. Our CEO nodded toward me. "Michael?" I opened my notebook, then asked the first question. "Can you explain the increase in client attrition over the last 3 years?" Richard's smile weakened. "Slightly, but noticeably." He provided an answer. "Economic conditions, market pressures, competitive challenges, reasonable explanations. The problem was they weren't supported by the data." I asked a second question, then a third, then a fourth. Each one focused on measurable facts. Each one exposed inconsistencies. Each one revealed leadership decisions that had contributed to the company's decline. I wasn't attacking him. I wasn't embarrassing him. I was simply asking questions. The same kind of questions executives ask every day. But something interesting started happening. The more Richard answered, the more uncomfortable the room became. Board members exchanged looks. Executives took notes. The CFO frowned repeatedly, because the answers weren't adding up. At one point, Richard blamed staffing shortages. Unfortunately for him, the employee turnover reports were sitting directly in front of us. At another point, he blamed market volatility. Unfortunately for him, competitors operating in the same market were growing. The facts kept undermining the narrative. And for the first time since entering the room, Richard began looking nervous. I recognized the feeling. 3 years earlier, I had stood in front of a room while Richard controlled the conversation. Now the situation had reversed. Except this time, nobody was being humiliated. Nobody was being blamed. The facts were speaking for themselves. By the end of the meeting, one thing had become painfully clear. Hale Logistics wasn't suffering from bad luck, it was suffering from poor leadership, and everyone in the room knew it, including Richard. The final presentation concluded. The executives from Hale Logistics were escorted to a waiting lounge while our committee discussed the findings privately. As the door closed behind Richard, I noticed something I had never seen before. Fear, real fear. Because for the first time in his career, Richard Hale wasn't the most powerful person in the room, and deep down I think he knew exactly what was coming. The next morning I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because I needed additional preparation. I'd already reviewed every report, every financial statement, every operational assessment, every leadership evaluation. I knew Hale Logistics better than some of the executives still working there. No, I arrived early because I wanted a few moments to clear my head. The truth was, I wasn't nervous about the acquisition. I was nervous about Richard. Not because he intimidated me anymore. That part of my life was over. I simply didn't know how I would feel seeing him again. 3 years is a long time. Long enough to rebuild a career. Long enough to rebuild confidence. Long enough to rebuild a life. But some memories never completely disappear, and Richard Hale was attached to one of the most painful memories I had. At 8:45, members of the acquisition committee began arriving. The CFO, the CEO, two board representatives, legal counsel, several senior executives. One by one, they took their seats. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room doors opened. Richard walked in. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. He looked older, not dramatically older, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying problems for too long. Behind him were several members of his leadership team. I recognized a few faces. Others were new. Richard entered smiling, professional, confident, prepared. Then his eyes found me. The smile disappeared immediately, not completely, just enough, a tiny crack in the mask, but I saw it, and based on the reactions around the room, I wasn't the only one. Richard's footsteps slowed. His eyes narrowed slightly. For a second he seemed unsure whether he was actually seeing me. Then recognition settled in. The color drained from his face, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for me to know exactly what he was thinking. Michael Carter. The employee he had publicly humiliated. The employee he had publicly fired. The employee he probably assumed would never cross his path again. Now sitting on the executive committee reviewing his company. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The room remained silent for several moments after the Hale executives left. Everyone reviewed their notes, financial reports, operational assessments, leadership evaluations. 3 years earlier, Richard had reduced a complicated situation to a simple accusation. Find someone to blame. Problem solved. The irony was that reality rarely works that way. Real business problems leave evidence, and the evidence sitting in front of us was overwhelming. The CFO spoke first. The assets are valuable. Several people nodded. He wasn't wrong. Hale Logistics still possessed strong infrastructure, excellent geographic positioning, long-standing industry relationships. The company itself wasn't beyond saving, the leadership was the issue. One board member flipped through a report. The operational problems aren't accidental. Another nodded. They're systemic. Our CEO leaned back in his chair. What concerns me most is the repeated pattern. Everyone knew what he meant. Ignored warnings, delayed responses, poor accountability, executive turnover. The same issues appeared again and again. Different departments, different years, same leadership behavior. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Nobody mentioned my history with Richard. Nobody needed to. The decision would be based entirely on evidence, exactly as it should be. Finally, the CEO looked around the room. Are we ready to vote? One by one, heads nodded. The vote was unanimous. Acquire the company, replace leadership, protect the business, protect the employees, protect the clients. The decision wasn't emotional, it wasn't personal, it was practical. Then the Hale executives were invited back into the room. Richard entered looking tense. The confidence from earlier had disappeared. Everyone took their seats. The CEO began speaking. After summarizing the review process, he delivered the decision. We intend to move forward with the acquisition. For a brief moment relief flashed across Richard's face. He thought he had won. Then the CEO continued. However, significant leadership restructuring will be required. The relief vanished instantly. You could almost see the realization hitting him. The company would survive, but his position would not. The CEO carefully outlined the transition plan. New leadership, new reporting structure, new operational oversight. Every detail was professional, respectful, objective. Yet the message remained clear. Richard Hale would no longer be running the company. When the explanation finished, silence filled the room. Then Richard spoke. His voice sounded different now, smaller, less certain. We all make mistakes. Nobody responded immediately. The room remained quiet. Then I looked up from my notes, and for the first time that day I addressed him directly. That's true. Every eye in the room shifted toward us. I continued calmly. Some mistakes cost people their jobs. Silence. Complete silence. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't accusing him. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply stating a fact both of us understood. Richard stared at me. For several seconds he appeared ready to respond. Then something changed. Maybe he remembered that conference room. Maybe he remembered the accusations. Maybe he remembered the day security escorted me out. Whatever he remembered, he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The evidence had already spoken. The decision had already been made. And for the first time in our entire history, Richard couldn't blame someone else. As the meeting ended, executives began gathering documents and leaving the room. The acquisition was approved, the future of the company was secured, and the fate Richard once controlled so easily was no longer his to decide. But the most important conversation of the day still hadn't happened, because as everyone filed out of the boardroom, Richard remained behind. And judging by the look on his face, he wanted to speak with me alone. I gathered my notes slowly, not because I needed more time, because I already knew Richard was waiting. The boardroom had mostly emptied. The CEO had left. The legal team had left. Even the assistants collecting documents had disappeared into the hallway. Within minutes, only two people remained: Richard and me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. 3 years earlier, Richard had never allowed silence. He always controlled conversations, controlled meetings, controlled outcomes. Today felt different. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed unsure of himself. He loosened his tie slightly, looked toward the window, then back at me. "I didn't expect to see you here." I almost smiled. "Neither did I." He nodded slowly, as though he were still trying to process everything that had happened, the irony, the timing, the reversal, maybe all of it. Finally, he exhaled. "You've done well." This time the compliment sounded genuine, not forced, not strategic, just honest. "Thank you." Another silence. Then came the question I had been expecting. "Did you know?" I looked at him. "Know what?" "That my company was the acquisition target." I considered the question. "For a while, yes." He nodded again. "You could have made this personal." The statement hung in the air, because we both knew it was true. A less disciplined person probably would have, a less mature version of myself might have. 3 years earlier I had dreamed about proving him wrong, about exposing him, about watching him experience the same humiliation he gave me. But life had taught me something important. Real success changes your priorities. By the time this acquisition appeared on my desk, revenge was no longer driving me. Growth was. I leaned back in my chair. "The decision wasn't personal, Richard." His expression tightened. "Maybe not for you." For the first time all day he looked tired. Not physically, emotionally, like a man carrying years of consequences. Then something happened that genuinely surprised me. He looked down, not at me, at the table, almost as if he couldn't maintain eye contact. I handled that situation badly. The words were quiet, barely above a whisper, but they landed harder than any dramatic apology ever could. 3 years. 3 years waiting to hear some acknowledgment. And now here it was, simple, late, but real. I studied him carefully. Part of me expected an excuse to follow, an explanation, a justification, something. Instead, he continued: "I should have listened. I didn't interrupt. I should have paid attention to the warnings." Still, I remained silent. "And I definitely shouldn't have blamed you." There it was. The truth. Not delivered in front of 200 employees. Not delivered during a board meeting. Just one man finally admitting what he had known all along. For a moment I thought about everything that had happened: the humiliation, the warehouse job, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the fear, the years spent rebuilding. Then I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Not because what he did was acceptable, because I had already moved beyond it. The opposite of anger isn't forgiveness, it's indifference. And somewhere along the way, Richard Hale had stopped being the center of my story. I looked directly at him. "You know what the strange part is?" He frowned slightly. "What?" "If you hadn't fired me, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today." He stared at me, confused. So I continued: "I would have stayed comfortable. Maybe. I would have stayed where I was." He didn't respond, because deep down I think he knew I was right. I smiled slightly, not out of arrogance, not out of revenge, just honesty. "3 years ago you thought ending my career would destroy me." The room became completely silent. "It turned out being fired was the best thing that ever happened to me." Richard looked away. Not because he disagreed, because he couldn't. Every piece of evidence was sitting right in front of him. The truth wasn't debatable. I stood and gathered my notebook. The conversation was over. The chapter was over. As I reached the door, Richard spoke one final time. Michael, I turned. I'm sorry. For a second, I simply looked at him, then I nodded. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just enough. And then I walked away. No victory speech, no insults, no humiliation, no revenge, just closure. And for the first time in years, it felt complete. A few weeks later, life returned to normal, or at least as normal as life ever gets. The acquisition moved forward. Transition teams were assigned, operational changes began, new leadership structures were implemented, business continued, as it always does. One Friday afternoon my phone rang. The caller ID made me smile. Sarah. I hadn't spoken to her in several months. I answered immediately. Hey, Sarah. You have a minute? For you? Always. She laughed. Then her tone became more serious. I thought you'd want an update. I already knew what she meant. Hale Logistics. The company where everything had started, the company where everything had nearly ended. So? There was a pause. Then she said something I never expected. People are happy. I blinked. Happy? Honestly, yes. That wasn't the answer I thought I'd hear. Sarah continued. The atmosphere is completely different. I leaned back in my chair, listening. No one's afraid to speak during meetings anymore. That caught my attention. Really? Really. She laughed. People actually challenge ideas now. Another pause. Turns out that's healthy. I smiled. Imagine that. An organization where employees could identify problems without fearing punishment, a concept Richard never fully understood. Sarah kept talking. Departments were communicating better. Managers were collaborating. Employee turnover was decreasing. Several former employees had even returned, not because the company was perfect, because people finally believed their voices mattered. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a while, looking out the window of my office. Traffic moved below. Clouds drifted across the afternoon sky, and for the first time I reflected on the entire journey from beginning to end. The public firing, the embarrassment, the warehouse job, the rejection letters, the endless nights studying, the promotions, the acquisition, the boardroom, Richard, everything. Years earlier, I believed success meant proving people wrong. I believed victory meant defeating the people who hurt you. Life had taught me something different. The greatest victories aren't about your enemies, they're about yourself. Richard losing his position wasn't what mattered most. Watching a healthier company emerge wasn't what mattered most. Even hearing his apology wasn't what mattered most. The thing that mattered most was who I had become, because somewhere between the humiliation and the comeback, I stopped being the person who needed validation from Richard Hale. I became someone stronger, someone more confident, someone more capable, someone who no longer needed permission to believe in himself. My phone buzzed, a calendar reminder for an executive strategy meeting. Another ordinary day, another opportunity, another challenge. I grabbed my notebook and stood. As I walked toward the door, I thought about something Emily had said months earlier. If Richard hadn't fired you, none of this would have happened. Back then, I thought she was trying to make me feel better. Now I understood she had been right. The worst day of my life had forced me to build a better one. And in the end, that was the real revenge. Not deciding Richard Hale's fate, not watching him lose power, not seeing karma arrive. The real revenge was becoming the person he never believed I could become. And that victory was something nobody could ever take away from me. Before you go, tell me, who was more responsible for what happened, Richard or the people who stayed silent while he humiliated me? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where karma eventually catches up with people, subscribe to Revenge Stories with Rinsola. Until next time, take care.